Alexander Skeel and Marissa Klyne. Two names that on the surface seemed ordinary. But behind closed doors, their story became one of the most disturbing cases of modern abuse ever recorded. He was a quiet, intelligent young man with a future. She was calculated, emotionless, and dangerous. Over 16 months, Marissa turned Alexander's life into a twisted prison of pain, fear, and total control, hidden in plain sight. What unfolded behind the walls of their apartment wasn't just abuse, it was psychological warfare. This is the horrifying true story that no one saw coming, until it was nearly too late. In the quiet English town of Elmsbridge, nothing ever seemed out of place. Neighbors knew each other by name, children played in the parks without fear, and the crime rate was nearly non-existent. Among the town's many peaceful residents was a 22-year-old man named Alexander Skeel. He worked part-time at a charming old bookstore on Abbey Road and lived in a modest flat not far from the town center. He was known for his politeness, his calm demeanor, and his genuine love for literature and history. People who met Alexander rarely forgot his soft-spoken nature and the kindness in his eyes. It seemed impossible to imagine that he would one day become the victim of one of the most horrific abuse cases in recent British history. Alexander had been in a relationship with a woman named Marissa Klyne. They had met about a year earlier at a local art exhibit hosted by the Elmsbridge Cultural Society. Marissa was hard to miss. She had a sharp, elegant look, wore dark clothing, and spoke very little, often answering in short phrases or nods. While some found her distant, Alexander had been captivated. Within weeks of meeting, they began dating. By the third month, they were living together in Alexander's flat. Friends were surprised by how quickly things moved, but Alexander seemed happy, at least in the beginning. Marissa kept a low profile. She didn't socialize, had no known friends, and never seemed to leave the house unless absolutely necessary. When she did, she walked with a confidence that made people step aside. She rarely smiled. Some described her as intense. Others said she had a coldness behind her green eyes that made them uneasy. Still, people dismissed it. Everyone has quirks, they said, and if Alexander was happy, who were they to interfere? For the first few months, there was no reason for concern. Alexander still showed up for work, visited his parents on weekends, and occasionally met friends for coffee. But slowly, things began to change. He became more distant. He started turning down invitations, saying he was busy or tired. His text replies got shorter, sometimes just a single word. When he did show up, he looked thinner and tired. He had visible bruises once. He said he fell while lifting boxes at work. Another time, he had a burn on his hand and claimed it was an accident while cooking. His friends noticed, but no one pushed him too hard. He insisted everything was fine, and eventually, they accepted his explanations. After a while, Alexander stopped showing up to work altogether. He didn't return calls or messages. His coworkers assumed he had quit without notice, something uncharacteristic but not unheard of. At the same time, Marissa became more present online. Her social media showed images of the two of them smiling, often captioned with words like blessed or my soulmate. But those who knew Alexander found the photos strange. He didn't look like himself. He looked gaunt, with a forced expression and eyes that seemed empty. It didn't match the person they remembered. Marissa's online life portrayed a relationship full of affection and harmony. But no one had actually seen Alexander in person for weeks. Whenever someone knocked on the door, Marissa would answer and say he wasn't feeling well. She claimed he had the flu, then later said he was recovering from a stomach bug. It became routine. Marissa answering the door, blocking any access to Alexander. One of the neighbors, Mrs. Holloway, who lived in the flat below, once heard crying through the vents. She thought it was a TV at first, but then it happened again, sobbing. Then a loud thud. She considered calling the police but decided against it, thinking she might be overreacting. Regret would come later, when she realized those were the sounds of a young man slowly being broken down, both physically and mentally. Outside, the world continued on. People went to work, attended town meetings, and enjoyed weekend fairs. Inside, Alexander Skeel's home, however, a nightmare was unfolding. A carefully concealed nightmare orchestrated by the one person he trusted the most. The illusion was perfect, at least from the outside. But behind the curtains of that modest Elmsbridge flat, a horrifying story had already begun. Behind the closed doors of Alexander Skeel's flat, time had stopped. Each day bled into the next, a blur of silence, pain, and control. What had once been a home was now a prison, one without bars, but far more terrifying. Alexander had no freedom. His every movement, thought, and breath were dictated by Marissa Klyne. What had started as emotional manipulation soon transformed into something far darker, far more calculated. The abuse crept in slowly. At first, it was simple isolation. Marissa told Alexander that his friends didn't care about him. She claimed his family was toxic and wanted to pull them apart. She convinced him to block people, delete contacts, and stop going out. She cut his ties to the outside world until the only person left was her. Then she took his phone, saying he no longer needed it. She told him that the internet was poisoning his mind. His books disappeared one by one. His clothes were replaced with plain, oversized garments. Even his reflection was taken away. Mirrors in the flat were removed or covered. She didn't want him to see what he was becoming. Marissa controlled his food. At first, she underfed him. Small portions, sometimes. No meals at all for days. Then she began forcing him to eat foods she knew he hated, sometimes rotten or unclean. If he refused, she punished him. At first, it was slaps, thrown objects, or long hours locked in the bathroom. But over time, the punishments grew darker. She began using hot metal to burn his skin. She cut him with small knives and told him to stay quiet. Screaming would only make it worse. He quickly learned silence was his only defense. She called them tests. She said they were necessary to prove his love. She kept a small, locked journal that she wrote in every day. In it, she tracked every supposed offense, looking at her too long, looking away too quickly, breathing too loud, sleeping when she didn't give permission. Every entry had a punishment. It was systematic, cold, and horrifyingly precise. She even documented the injuries with a camera, labeling each image with a number and date. It was more than cruelty. It was obsession. Alexander's body began to weaken. He lost weight rapidly. His skin turned pale, his eyes sunken. His hands trembled constantly from nerve damage. But his mind was what Marissa wanted to break most. She began forcing him to repeat phrases like, "I deserve this," and "I belong to you." If he hesitated, the punishments returned. She once forced him to stand still for 6 hours without sitting or leaning against anything. If he moved, he was hit with a belt. By the end of it, he had collapsed, unable to lift his legs. Despite his physical condition, Marissa made him do household chores, cleaning, scrubbing the bathroom floors with a toothbrush, washing dishes while standing barefoot on freezing tiles. She never let him sleep more than a few hours at a time. She kept the flat freezing cold during winter, opening windows at night while Alexander shivered under a thin blanket on the floor. She watched him constantly, even placing a small mirror under the door when he was in the bathroom to make sure he wasn't wasting time. The outside world had no idea what was happening. Neighbors occasionally heard strange noises, whimpers, loud bangs, something crashing against a wall, but they brushed it off. Marissa was always so composed when answering the door, always polite. If anyone asked about Alexander, she would say he was sleeping or feeling unwell. Her tone made people uneasy, but they couldn't prove anything. and so the silence continued. Alexander became a ghost inside his own life. He no longer thought about escape. He no longer believed in freedom. He stopped wondering if anyone missed him or if help would ever come. His world had shrunk to 4 walls and 1 person. Every day began with fear and ended in pain. And through it all, Marissa watched him, not with anger, but with calm fascination, as though she were conducting an experiment rather than destroying a human being. Marissa Klyne believed she had perfected the art of control. Every moment of Alexander Skeel's life was under her surveillance. She had eliminated outside contact, restricted his movements, manipulated his thoughts, and ensured that he existed, solely under her command. In her mind, she had built a system too tight to fail. But there was one variable she hadn't accounted for: someone watching from a distance. Inspector Elijah Murrin was not a man who thrived on hunches. He was methodical, reserved, and not easily rattled. When an anonymous report landed on his desk, at the Elmsbridge precinct about a young man looking ill and distressed through a top-floor window, he almost dismissed it. The complaint was vague. No address, no names, just a note scribbled on a torn envelope and dropped through the station's after-hours mail slot, but something about the wording stuck with him. He looked scared to be seen. Elijah began his quiet investigation. It wasn't easy. There was no direct evidence, no one willing to come forward, and no prior history of domestic complaints at Alexander's flat. But the inspector wasn't deterred. He visited the local shops, asking if anyone had seen Alexander recently. The bookstore confirmed he hadn't returned in months. A nearby cafe used to see him every Wednesday. But nothing in weeks. He reached out to Alexander's brother, Jeremy Skeel, who hadn't heard from him since a short, tense phone call 2 months prior. Jeremy admitted something had felt off. Alexander had sounded robotic, distant. Digging deeper, Elijah ran a background check on Marissa Klyne. The results were puzzling. She had no employment history, no registered schooling, no health records, no tax returns, no government ID traces before she showed up in Elmsbridge. It was as if she didn't exist until she moved in with Alexander. For someone as tightly woven into his daily life, she left almost no digital or legal footprint. That wasn't just strange. It was alarming. Elijah visited the building under the guise of checking gas meters. When he knocked on Alexander's door, Marissa answered quickly. Her posture was rigid, her tone clipped. She refused to let him enter. She smiled, said everything was fine, and closed the door before he could ask more. Elijah lingered in the hallway, trying to listen. The flat was silent, too silent. The inspector returned the next day, then again the day after. Each time, he tried a different approach, posing as a postal worker, a delivery man. But Marissa never let him pass the threshold. What disturbed him most was how calm she remained, as though she had practiced these encounters 1,000 times, in her mind. With no legal ground to enter the property, Elijah turned to observation. He spoke to the tenants across the street, one of whom, an elderly man named Mr. Cattle, agreed to let Elijah install a small surveillance camera in his attic window. It was angled toward Alexander's kitchen, just visible through the thin, stained curtains. At first, there was nothing, no movement, no sign of life. Then, one afternoon, the camera captured a flicker. A shadow moved across the kitchen tiles, barefoot, limping, hunched. It was Alexander. The footage was grainy, but it was enough. Elijah zoomed in and replayed the clip again and again. Alexander's face was hollow. His ribs showed through a torn shirt. He looked like he hadn't eaten properly in weeks. Days later, the camera caught something even more chilling. Alexander was seen standing in the kitchen for several minutes, motionless, as though frozen by fear. Marissa entered the frame, grabbed his arm, and shoved him violently. He fell out of view. She calmly returned seconds later, wiping something from her hands with a cloth. Alaya compiled the footage and filed for an emergency warrant, but the request was denied. Insufficient cause. It was not enough to prove a crime was occurring, only suspicion. Frustrated but undeterred, Alaya returned to his station and started preparing a full report. Time was slipping away. He knew that Alexander didn't have much longer. The look in that young man's eyes through the window, sunken, pleading, was not just fear. It was a silent cry for help from a prison no one could see. Days turned into weeks, and Alexander Skeel's condition worsened. His body was failing. Open wounds covered his back and arms. Several of his ribs were cracked. He had infections that festered without treatment. His teeth were rotting. He could barely stand. Yet Marissa Klyne continued her cruelty with a chilling sense of routine. She didn't shout or scream. She delivered punishment the way others might water a plant, coldly, habitually, as if it were normal. She no longer allowed him to sleep in a bed. A damp towel on the floor was his mattress, and his blanket was an old curtain with holes in it. She rationed water, giving him only enough to survive. When she bathed him, it was with scalding hot water poured from a kettle, and only when she felt like it. He had no privacy, no rest, no voice. Despite the pain, Alexander never attempted escape. Marissa had drilled fear into him so deeply that even the idea of defiance felt fatal. She told him over and over again that no one would help him, that no one cared, that if he ran, she would find him and finish what she started. He believed her. But the outside world was beginning to wake up. Inspector Alaya Murrin, still working, behind the scenes had continued collecting evidence. He reached out to hospital records across counties looking for any past trace of Marissa. He combed through missing persons cases and contacted nearby towns. Nothing matched. It was as though Marissa Klyne had no past, no origin. But one piece finally surfaced. A medical staff member in a private mental health clinic over 50 miles away remembered a woman with a similar name, Melissa Kay. She had once been admitted after assaulting her older sister and had been diagnosed with a severe personality disorder. There was no legal record, but the clinic had kept notes. Alaya took this unofficial report to a higher-level officer, Sergeant Lita Wern, who agreed something needed to be done. Together, they arranged for a welfare check through emergency services, this time under the pretense of a potential medical emergency. It wasn't a raid, just a knock. But it would be the knock that saved Alexander's life. On a cold, overcast morning, paramedics and officers arrived at the door. Marissa opened it, looking composed but annoyed. She claimed everything was fine, that her partner had the flu. When asked to produce Alexander, she hesitated for too long. One of the paramedics took the opportunity to force his way past her into the hallway. What they found would haunt them for years. Alexander was curled in the corner of the bedroom, barely conscious. He weighed less than 100 pounds. His body was a roadmap of injury, burns, lacerations, bruises in every color. Some wounds were old, some were fresh. He was wearing only underwear, and even that was soaked in blood. He tried to stand but collapsed before anyone could catch him. His lips moved, but no words came out. Marissa didn't fight. She didn't run. She simply stood there, watching the scene with a flat expression. She was handcuffed without resistance. One of the officers reported that she seemed disappointed, not afraid. As though something sacred had been interrupted, Alexander was rushed to the hospital under emergency care. Doctors later said he was 10 days away from death. His body was in complete shutdown. He had infections in his organs, and the trauma to his brain from repeated blows was irreversible in some areas. He could not speak for days. When he finally could, he whispered just one sentence. "I thought it would never end." News of the rescue spread through Elmsbridge like wildfire. Neighbors who had once seen Marissa at the store, polite and poised, couldn't believe the truth. People who had brushed off strange noises or ignored their instincts now carried the weight of guilt. But Alexander had survived. Barely. And though the damage was unimaginable, for the first time in over a year, he was finally free from the woman who had turned his life into a living nightmare. Alexander Skeel's recovery was not immediate, nor was it simple. His body had endured unimaginable suffering. Doctors who examined him described it as one of the worst cases of domestic torture they had ever seen. Bones had fused incorrectly from untreated fractures. His skin bore the permanent imprint of burns, cuts, and whip marks. Malnutrition had weakened his immune system, and several of his teeth had to be removed due to rot and infection. But the deepest wounds weren't physical. They were inside his mind. He barely spoke during his first 2 weeks in the hospital. When asked questions, he stared at the ceiling or turned his head away. Psychologists diagnosed him with severe PTSD, depression, and emotional disassociation. It would take months before he could trust anyone enough to speak openly. The trauma had left him fragile, and even basic things like opening a curtain or turning on a light triggered panic. The trial of Marissa Klyne began 6 months later. The courtroom was packed with press, legal observers, and domestic violence experts. What came out during the proceedings shocked even the most seasoned professionals. Prosecutors presented hundreds of photos that Marissa had taken herself. Images of Alexander's wounds, of blood-stained towels, of scribbled punishment lists in her private journal. They also found videos where she had documented her actions, narrating them in a calm, detached voice, as if she were conducting an experiment. The most chilling piece of evidence was a timeline she had created, predicting how long it would take to fully erase Alexander's sense of self. Her notes included phrases like, "test resistance to pain," and "reduce verbal response to 0." It was a blueprint for psychological destruction. She had not acted out of impulse or anger. She had planned every stage of his breakdown. Her defense argued mental illness, claiming she lacked capacity. But court-appointed psychiatrists testified that Marissa was fully aware of her actions and had gone to extreme lengths to hide them. She had calculated every move, covered every track, and anticipated every question. She wasn't out of control. She was in total control. When the verdict came, the room was silent. Guilty on all counts: false imprisonment, grievous bodily harm, coercive control, and attempted murder. The judge called it a case of pure, sustained sadism. Marissa Klyne was sentenced to 30 years in prison without parole. She showed no emotion as she was led away, her expression just as flat and cold as the day she was arrested. Alexander didn't attend the sentencing. He was still rebuilding his life, one fragile step at a time. He moved into a protected housing unit with round-the-clock care. Social workers helped him reconnect with his family, though the reunion was difficult. He no longer knew how to be around people. Laughter made him anxious. Hugs felt foreign. Noise overwhelmed him. But his brother Jeremian remained by his side, visiting every day, reminding him that he was safe now. Over the next year, Alexander began sharing his story through a trauma recovery organization. He didn't speak for sympathy. He spoke to bring awareness to the silent kind of abuse that often goes unnoticed. Abuse without black eyes or shouting matches. Abuse that isolates, controls, and breaks people in slow, invisible ways. His case became a national symbol of the dangers of coercive control and led to new training protocols for police officers, social workers, and healthcare professionals. Though he would never fully escape the shadows of what happened, Alexander found purpose in survival. He began writing, painting, and helping others who had endured similar horrors. His body bore the evidence of evil, but his spirit, slowly but surely, was reclaiming light. His name became a reminder that even in the darkest prisons, built not of steel but of fear and silence, there is always a way out if someone is willing to look closely enough to see what's hidden. And so, the story of Alexander Skeel ended, not with death, but with something even more powerful: resilience. In surviving, he did more than outlast his abuser. He exposed a nightmare, and in doing so, helped prevent the next.